Welcome to this Wheeler Centre event with Carmen Maria Machado. My name is Angela Meyer. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to the elders of any other communities who may be with us today. And let me introduce Carmen to you. Carmen Maria Machado is a fiction writer, critic and essayist whose work has appeared widely, including in The New Yorker, Granta, Guernica, Electric Literature, the Paris Review and the LA Review of Books. She has been awarded a number of prestigious fellowships and residencies and is currently writer-in-residence at the University of Pennsylvania. Her debut collection is Her Body and Other Parties. This book has been a finalist for the National Book Award, the Kirkus Prize, LA Times Book Prize Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction, the Dylan Thomas Prize, and the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction, and has been the winner of the Bard Fiction Prize, the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, and the Crawford Award. And I wanted to list all of those because it's pretty impressive.
It's very embarrassing.
No, own it. Recently, the New York Times listed Her Body and Other Parties as a member of the New Vanguard, one of 15 remarkable books by women that are shaping the way we read and write fiction in the 21st century. Would you please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Carmen? So Carmen, I want to ask you questions about what your work's about and elements within it, but I want to start with this rare quality your work has of probing the reader on a deep level, of stirring things from their own subconscious and their own drives. And I wonder if there was a moment where writing clicked for you, or clicks perhaps with each piece in getting it to a place where you unlock something in the reader.
Oh, that's a wonderful opening question. Also, hello, everyone. There was a point in my writing, I don't want to call it a career because it wasn't a career then, my sort of writing journey, no, journey sounds terrible, my writing process where, like, when I first went to grad school, like, you know, I did not major in literature. I was mostly self-taught, in terms of, like, my reading. I didn't really have any formal writing training except for, like, one class I took in college. And when I got to grad school, my classmates, as gently as possible, sort of let me know that most of what I was writing was like, you know, it was fine. It was very dramatic. There was a lot of, like, pregnant pauses and, like, serious situations. But a friend of mine was like, you know, like, when you do something weird, like, there's something that unlocks in the story. So, like, I had this really dreadful, very self-important story whose plot I will not even recount for you because it's so embarrassing. But there was a scene where death appears to a woman and begins to speak to her. And my friend was like, the rest of this is garbage, but that scene where death speaks to her is actually really interesting. And you should be reading all these different people. Angela Carter, Shirley Jackson, George Saunders, Karen Russell, Kelly Link. And I just started reading these, like, writers who sort of had this very, like, loose relationship with reality and who were really interested in things like ghosts and, like, liminality. And suddenly I felt like I understood something about what I wanted to be doing. And the next story that I wrote after that happened is a story that's in my book, and it's the first time I wrote a story that felt like it was in my voice, whatever that means, where I suddenly, I had a sense that I had created something that wasn't just like, I wasn't just imitating other people, like I had a sense of self in my work. And then ever since then, I've been just chugging right along. So, but that was the first time that I ever had that. So the story was Difficult at Parties, which is the last story in the collection.
So between them and now, does it feel like it comes a little easier when you sort of know that element is coming into the story, or does it just depend on each piece?
I mean, I feel like there's a point in each piece where I know what something is about, and I feel like the sort of essential aboutness of the story is the elusive thing that if I can't figure it out, the story is just dead in the water. So I also have a story in there called The Resident, which took me 3 years to finish, and I had sort of constructed and written the original structure and architecture of the story like years ago. And when my editor bought the book, it was the only book in there that had not been published. An editor had not seen it. And my editor, who was brilliant, sort of very gently said to me, I don't think you know what this story is about yet. There's like 8 plots in here. I can't sort of identify like a unification of theme. There's just too much stuff happening in here. And I feel like you need to figure out what the story is about. And so he sort of just told me like stuff that he was noticing, stuff that sort of themes he was noticing that were emerging that weren't meshing with each other, but that were sort of existing. And then at some point I like tugged on one of those threads and I wrote a scene that didn't exist in the story. And suddenly the whole thing snapped into place. And I like carved away these other parts and I suddenly realized that, and like nothing, it was like one additional scene and I cut out some stuff, but like it clicked into place. Mm-hmm. So I feel like that sense of aboutness is like what I'm searching for. And sometimes that happens really quickly and I'm like, I know what I want to write about, or I know like what I sort of want to get at. And other times it takes me a while to like figure it out. And I'm like, I'm just writing a weird haunted house story, and like hopefully at some point I'll figure out why.
What else is going on?
Right? Yeah. What else is actually happening, sort of within this piece?
Yeah.
So.
It's interesting you bring the resident into that, because for me that felt like a story that partly has the writing process in it, in the story, and it has the emotive aspects of the process. There's like the layers of stimulation of past and present, the distractions, the seeking, the way it distances you from people you love when you're deep in the process. Could you talk about the story a little bit more? It's really up there for me. I really loved it.
Thank you. So someone once said in a workshop, I workshopped it one time, only once, and this is why I only did it the one time. And someone was like, this woman is crazy. I hate Mad Woman in the Attic stories. And I was like, so she's me. And like she's me maybe
Awkward.
like 2 notches above where I am, because like I'm a deeply anxious, deeply weird person. Almost every weird thing she does in that story is something that I have done. She's like me to the point of dysfunction, and I feel like I'm like fairly functionally anxious and weird, but she's like a next level. But yeah, so everyone's like, oh, she's so like unlikable, and I'm like, well. So yeah, no, and it's funny because also when my editor, I remember when he bought the book, he was like, normally I hate stories about writers, but I feel like you sort of managed to pull it off, and I don't exactly know why it's different or in what way. But yeah, like I wanted a story that sort of grappled with this question of what is it, or what I should say, what the story ended up being about is this question of like, what does it mean for your traumas to define you? Mm-hmm. So not the question of like, do your traumas define you, but like, I think they do. And so what do you do with that information? Like, how do you proceed as like a person and an artist and a human being in the world, like knowing that you are sort of made up of a lot of experiences, including the worst experiences that have happened to you. And then to me, like writing is sort of because writing is how I sort of wanted to figure that out. So it seemed like writing had to be kind of like tangled up in the story. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and then just end up being a lot of like really weird, like her thinking about this other this character that is, the story you don't see. And yeah, I don't know. So anyway, yeah, the writing, sort of that element of it was really important to me in that story.
Yeah, well, I think everything that you've just said does mean it has such an element of authenticity. And that's also an overused word, but yeah. You mentioned the sort of anxious element, and I think a lot of the stories have these sort of shadows and bits of terror, and to me it reminded me of the feeling of being over-adrenalized a bit, where you do sort of like see things in the corner of your eye. And you've written about anxiety in your non-fiction a bit as well, and I'm wondering how much you feel that contributes to your fiction in general.
I think most successful writers, I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, I feel like most successful writers are anxious to some degree. I think that anxiety is a state of being like tuned to this like level, like a sort of a hypersensitive nervous system. And so that manifests in all kinds of terrible ways, like panic attacks and like, perseverating and hypochondria, which is all things that I do. But it also makes you just be like very aware of what's happening around you, which is like a quality that I think writers and other artists benefit from. So I feel like I've never met like a truly relaxed writer. Like I've never met a writer where I'm like, oh, you're super healthy and well-adjusted. Because there is this, you have to kind of have this sort of almost like diagonal relationship with the world. And so I think anxiety is a way in which that is possible. And since it's such a part of my life, it's just a part of my absolute everyday. Before I came here, I was at another festival, and I tripped like dramatically down a slow flight of stairs, and then was convinced that I had ruptured my spleen, and was just thinking about my possibly ruptured spleen for like days, and was like on the plane to Australia thinking, well, if I bleed out here on this plane, they won't be able to do anything for me, and I'll just delay it and I'll be dead. But it was a good run, and sort of that process of like catastrophizing and like projecting potential things into the future is what writing is, right? Like that's what fiction is like you're like imagining like, what if this thing happened, what happens after that? And that's also the process of anxiety and hypochondria. It's just like fiction. So I think it's helpful. Sorry, I forgot what your question was.
No, I think you answered it perfectly, and it's
Excellent.
I think it's fascinating. Another common element in the stories is ghostly, faded, transparent women. Can you talk a bit about that, having that as a recurring element in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in ghosts. I'm interested in, obviously this is a collection about the body, and, a lot of it is real things about the body that, like, we can reproduce. But the idea of sort of corporeality on this, like, very fundamental level where it's like there's like a knob being turned between, like, what is there and what is not, and, like, women or ghosts or, like, people existing somewhere on this spectrum is, like, very interesting to me. It's also that thing where, like, I didn't notice I was doing that until, like, an interviewer pointed it out to me, which is actually, like, a weird thing about writing that no one tells you, which is, like, I feel like half the stuff everyone's like, oh yeah, like the symbolism of the ghost. And I was like, oh no, I didn't even realize I had done that. And I feel like I'm sure if you like did some like hypnosis or like psychoanalysis, there's like some trauma or something that happened in my past about like a transparent, that involved like a ghost or something where I got like really burned into my subconscious, and like now it just like comes out when I'm writing. I don't know what that was. Maybe I've blocked it out, but clearly it's important to me because I do write about it a lot.
So book reviews can be like analysis in a way. They're bringing out the...
Oh, it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I had an interviewer say to me, all your stories except for the big weird one in the middle are all first person. Like, can you talk about first person? And I was like, I did not even know I did that. Yeah, it's like sometimes people have to point it out to you.
There you go.
Yeah.
So one of the stories that has that element of the transparent women is Real Women Have Bodies. Do you mind doing a small reading from that one?
Yeah. I have the different cover. I have the American cover. Sorry, what was it? I'm like, where am I? Okay, here we go. So I don't know if I need to preface this at all. The protagonist of this story is, she works in a dress shop in a mall, and she's sort of existing through this pandemic, which I'm about to describe what this pandemic looks like. The first reports started at the height of the recession. The first victims, the first women, had not been seen in public for weeks. Many of the concerned friends and family who broke into their homes and apartments were expecting to find dead bodies. I guess what they found was worse. There was a video that went viral a few years back, amateur footage from a landlord in Cincinnati who brought a video camera with him in order to cover his ass as he evicted a woman who had fallen behind on her rent. He walked from room to room, calling her name, swinging the camera this way and that, and making wisecracks. He had a lot of things to say about her artwork, her dirty dishes, the vibrator on her nightstand. You could almost miss the punchline to the whole meandering affair if you were not looking closely enough. But then the camera spun around, and there she was, in the most sun-drenched corner of the bedroom, hidden by the light. She was naked and trying to conceal it. You could see her breast through her arm, the wall through her torso. She was crying. The sound was so soft that the inane chatter of the landlord had covered it until then. But then you could hear it, miserable, terrified. No one knows what causes it. It's not passed in the air. It's not sexually transmitted. It's not a virus or a bacteria, or if it is, it's nothing that scientists have been able to find. At first, everyone blamed the fashion industry, then the millennials, finally the water. But the water's been tested. The millennials aren't the only ones going incorporeal, and it doesn't do the fashion industry any good to have women fading away. You can't put clothes on air, not that they haven't tried. All right.
In that story, you describe a shock of pleasure at one point, and I love the way that you describe physical wanting in so many of the stories, and in particular, women desiring other women. Is it important to you to describe women desiring?
Yes, it is.
Tell us more.
Well, this book has a lot of sex in it. So be forewarned if you. There's a lot of sex, and I was really interested when I was writing it. I've always loved sex writing in sort of literary fiction. In theory, but a lot of the sort of explicit sexual content in literary fiction is written by old straight white men, and there were some exceptions in terms of like what I like. So there's a really wonderful American author, Nicholson Baker, who I absolutely love, who has written some like really beautiful, really tender, really funny sort of sex books. Like he wrote this one called Vox that was very famously given from Bill Clinton to Monica Lewinsky as like, I guess, an erotic gesture. But it's actually this really beautiful sort of weird novel. It's all entirely in dialogue, and it's a man calling like a sex chat line, and it's him talking to this woman. And it's really like explicit and really weird. And he's a lot of like weird books like that. And he's kind of an exception where like the sex actually is very like tender and interesting. And the women seem real and interesting. But there are other sort of unnamed writers who I would read their work and I would just feel this like sense of contempt for the female body and this something very just unpleasant. And also there would be like other scenes in other books where everyone would they would be very like sad. Like it would be like everyone having these like perfunctory orgasms and then like turning away in sorrow, And I was just not interested in that. And it was not to say that like sex can't be sometimes bad and disappointing, because it definitely can be, or terrible. But I also, I was like really interested in pleasure and thinking about, what would it be like to like write a bunch of women who are like queer, who are really interested in just like fucking, who like, could sort of articulate their desire and their feelings really clearly. And I just, I wanted that. And it's this thing where like, I wanted it, so I wrote it. Because I was like, well, no one else is doing it, so I might as well. And so like thinking about just like letting them as people and as like sexual beings and like just letting that kind of shine through and embody the text, I guess.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Do you find it surprising that it is the case that it's still, like I found when I was reading it, that I definitely hadn't read much like that, that we're still kind of at a point where there isn't a lot of queer, particularly by women.
Yeah.
And in the mainstream, I shouldn't say, there's a lot out there, but.
Right. I mean, right. And obviously, like, there's a lot of, I guess it's this very specific, like, explicit sex being written in, like, literary fiction for the purpose of, like, deepening characterization and, like, doing all the things that, like, any kind of plot device would do in literary fiction or, like, any kind of stylistic choice. It's not common. I think I've had people say to me, like, oh, I couldn't do it. Like, I couldn't read your book. It was like, or like people have like reviewers been like, oh, there's a lot of sex in here. And I'm like, people have sex.
Yeah, that's right.
including queer women, it's like,
deal with it.
right, yeah, it's like, I don't know what else to say to you, like, surprise,
It's so funny that they'd said that to you.
People say, shocking. Well, I won't get into that.
You could. It's a
People
safe
love to be
space.
honest.
Yeah, I bet. In The Husband Stitch, there's a moment where the protagonist tells her husband about her desire for another woman. And in listening, he takes ownership over this desire in a way. I found that really poignant, that scene. But can you tell us a bit more about that story, The Husband Stitch? That's the first one.
Yeah, so it's based on, I don't really know about here, but when the book came out in the UK, I noticed in a lot of reviews that people didn't seem to know the legend that it's based on. And I don't know if that's true here as well, but there's this folktale that was in this book. There was this book that came out in the 80s, or like the early 80s, called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by this American folklorist named Alvin Schwartz. And they were pretty iconic. They were basically folktales and urban legends written for young people. And they had these really iconic, horrifying watercolor illustrations that like scarred an entire generation of like American kids. And they were just like, and they were just these like, I get to describe them as impossible. They were absolutely horrifying. And the stories were, the sorts of like urban legends, like, the hook-handed man and things like that. And the same author also had other books that weren't that set, that were for younger readers. And in it, there was a story called The Green Ribbon. And it was about this girl who has a green ribbon around her neck, and she kind of lives her life, and she like dates, or she like meets this boy, and he's always like, "What's the deal with the ribbon?" And she's like, "I can't tell you, sorry." And then they like get married. And then on her deathbed, she's like, "Okay, now I can tell you, you can untie the ribbon." And I had an audiobook version of this as a kid, and it was horrifying. And then so he unties the ribbon, and it said, "And then Jenny's head fell off." And it was like this really deep man, and I was just like, And there was something very disturbing. And so then like the final stage is like her head like on the floor, and so the idea that like she had this ribbon around her neck the whole time, and it's not so. It's actually based on, the origins of the story are sort of unclear. Like, there's a version of it that Washington Irving tells that's about the French Revolution, where it's the woman with a black ribbon around her neck. And also in the French Revolution, women used to wear, I guess, red ribbons to sort of signify the guillotine. So it has, like, but I don't know exactly, like, the precise sort of origins of this specific story. But it's very, like, kids just sort of know it. And, like, I don't know, I found myself sort of thinking about it and thinking, like, why did that story upset me so particularly? Like, what about it was so weird? And I think it was a combination of, like, the fact that, this guy is always just sort of asking her and asking her and asking her. And then also, and I think in my imagination, it was even more than because he only asked, it's like a really short story, so he'll ask her like twice or three times or something. But it feels like it's like her whole life. And then I also, just the idea of like sort of walking around with that kind of vulnerability, and it just felt metaphorically relevant. And I was like, interesting, okay. So I wrote a version of the story where it was just this woman and like living her life with her husband, and it's mostly like a realist story, but she has this ribbon around her neck, and it's sort of the same thing where he pursues this question of what the ribbon is and why can't he touch it and why can't he untie it for like their entire marriage. And then eventually I sort of incorporated other urban legends and other folktales from the Alvin Schwartz book into where she's like sort of telling other urban legends about other women, that like the woman who takes the liver from a corpse at a church to like feed to her husband because she's afraid he'll beat her because she like made the liver and then she ate it because it smelled so good, and then but she's like, oh, he'll beat me if like I don't get him dinner. So then she like takes a liver out of a corpse from the church next door, and then at night the corpse comes to her and is like, who has my liver? And also all these all these stories also like were ones that I told. Like I was a Girl Scout growing up, and I did a lot of campfire stuff. And the Alvin Schwartz books were great because there were instructions in them. So like the liver story, their instruction at the end was like, the ghost is sort of calling, who has my liver? And in the original story, it's like she flips back the blanket over from her husband, and she says he has it, but like in the book it's like grab the person closest to you. It'd be like that she has it or he has it. And so I grabbed this girl and like made her cry. And it was awesome. Like I was like, oh man, like storytelling can like affect people. She was like sobbing in fear because I'd scared her. And I was like, this is great. So yeah, so I feel like I really learned about
You learned some power of
storytelling.
storytelling there.
Yeah, I was like, storytelling is really powerful.
Yeah. So when you were writing the story, did you go back to that book?
I did,
The
yeah.
audio book or just...
What was that?
Did you listen to the audio book again?
No, I didn't. The audio, you can actually find a version of it on YouTube, like just that story on YouTube. And I did re-listen to that a couple of times, and it's still horrifying.
Yeah, right.
The delivery is very good.
Because sometimes you go back to things from childhood and you're like, oh, that's not scary at all. But
That's true. There is very famously, my mother. There was a Sesame Street skit about wet paint that used to terrify me, and I would like run screaming from the room. And I recently watched it. Like I looked at, because I was thinking about the story, and I was like, that's so weird. I looked it up, and it was just like this weird video about wet paint, and I was like, I don't understand why this was so scary. But that one I did look at it and be like, this is like horrifying. And like the guy who delivers it, it's like so dark.
Yeah.
So anyway.
From one body to another, do you want to talk a bit about what happens in 8 Bites, which is also another, they're all powerful stories, but yeah, this one I just absolutely loved.
Yeah, 8 Bites is, I feel like that story, there's a couple of stories in the collection that are really close to the bone, to the point where I actually almost don't ever read from them because it's like too much. But 8 Bites was a story where, so a lot of my stories, I start from like concepts. So The Husband Stitch, I wanted to retell this urban legend. Inventory, I wanted to write a story that was entirely sex scenes. Especially Heinous, I wanted to write about the show Law & Order SVU. But this one was one where I started from like an idea, like a question that I had. And the question was like, I really want to write about fatness, and I want to write about gastric bypass surgery, which I have, my mother has gotten, and my mom's entire family has gotten, and I have not. And I have a lot of feelings about it. And so I wanted to sort of write my feelings. I wanted to figure out what I thought and why it bothered me so badly. And so I just started writing this story about a woman who gets the surgery. And then it sort of came together with this idea that I'd had about a person being haunted by their own body. So as she loses the weight, it like reassembles elsewhere in her house, and it's sort of this like creature or like fat ghost. It's like not clear what it is. It's just this like, it's like this thing. It's like this sort of shapeless blob, but it's a sort of like has a body kind of. So yeah, and so there's this scene where she finds it, she like confronts it in the basement, and she like beats the shit out of it with like a broom handle. And then it just like takes it, and then she sort of goes on with the rest of her life, and she knows it's there, but like it never shows up, but it like leaves her presence. And then like when she dies, it like comes and takes her away, like years later as like an old woman. And it was only sort of writing those final beats that I realized that the thing that I was trying to articulate was that the body is like, the body, for all its foibles and its problems and its illnesses and its ways it fails you, is this like creature that like takes really good care of you, even though you treat it like shit, and you like, you know, you diet and you hate it, and you get really mad and try to cover it up, and you have this really like hostile relationship with it, or at least like nowadays most people do, and how sort of terrible that is, and that it will love you no matter what. Like it doesn't have any judgments. Like it's, you know, and it will always come back for you. And yeah, it took me like writing this whole weird thing to like, and then I was like, oh, I suddenly like understand my own thought process. But it took me writing the whole story to get to that place, which was strange. Yeah, so at that point, you know, it was more sort of approaching it as like an essential, like a question of like, what do I think?
Yeah.
And then like trying to answer that question.
Yeah. I haven't asked much about the construction of the stories, but in that story you bring in a description of the oysters, and that ends up sort of coming back in a way, or part of the description comes back in a way. And I'm sort of wondering in the process of writing the stories, how aware are you or how deliberately do you sort of plant imagery and come back to it, or does that sort of happen in a redrafting when you've worked out a bit more what it's about?
It sort of both. I mean, definitely a lot of the sort of the early drafting process is so instinctual that there's not a lot of thought. I mean, I'm usually thinking about certain elements, but sometimes I'll like write a scene or an image and like an image will get away from me and I'm like, that image makes literally no sense. Like, what are you doing? But then other times I'll go back and I'll notice that I'm like, yeah, there's like certain patterns. And other times I literally will not notice until someone asks me about it. And then I'm like, oh yeah. My friends used to tease me in grad school. They were like, they do these, you do a final reading and there's always a skit that introduces you and your friends do the skit and they like gently sort of roast you. And my friends like were me and they were like, I wrote 11 stories that I submitted to Water Metaphor Quarterly. And I was like, oh, do I use a lot of water metaphors? I guess I do. And I had not realized it until that moment. Part of it is just like, it's just sort of it's sort of what emerges, but I also keep really careful. So like I'm a real like idea curator. So like I have like an app on my phone and I have like places where I keep images. So like I think the oyster scene where she's like eating an oyster, then one of them is like stuck and then she's trying to like get it out. And there's like a lot of, it's just like this really like weird sort of food scene. It's just like a meal that I had. And like as I was like aggressively trying to like wrestle with this oyster that I wanted to get out of its shell that wouldn't come out of its shell, it's like all the thoughts that she has in that scene where she's like, it's like a tongue and like it's like trying to kill me and like if it was any justice in this world they would just like choke me to death because here I am like eating it out of the shell. Those are like literally it's just like a step for step my thought process as I was trying to eat this damn oyster, trying to get it out of its shell. So I feel like like a lot of that is just like, and then I was like, oh, that's a really weird set of thoughts you had. Write that down and put that in something because otherwise, it's wasted.
And it worked. I love, even as you're speaking, but thinking about the stories again, there is a real sense of humour to them while they're also touching very difficult things and they're touching a nerve a lot of the time. Do you like the idea of the reader being amused at the same time?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's weird. Like when I first started, I did a reading of the Law and Order story years ago, like right after I'd published it. And this really bizarre thing happened where in between the episodes, people would just like bark laughter. Like the audience is sort of like would be like, ha! But like as a group, like everybody. And I was like, why are they laughing? Like this is very serious, But people laugh when you don't know what else to do, right? Like laughter is sort of your body's way of like releasing tension and like being like, I'm uncomfortable, and also I'm like sort of amused, but also like I don't know what to, and like you laugh, and that's just like what you do. And I feel like also you have to sort of have a good sense of humor about the fact that like, for example, as a woman, like your life is a living nightmare. Like your body is forfeit, if you're like queer or you're not white or you're like anything at all that just like falls outside of like the parameters of like sort of what is sort of the like the sort of the power structure. Like you kind of have to laugh because otherwise you just would like sob and like rend, rub ash in your hair and like rend your garments, which is what I want to do on like a daily basis. So there's something about humor that like lightens that. And like I don't know if you guys have, I don't know if but there was this correspondence dinner that they have every year in the United States. It's like the White House journalists with like politicians. And this really amazing Michelle Wolf is like really wonderful comedian, gave this like really like scathing, incredible barn burning routine where she just like tore everyone to shreds and like just took everyone to task. And it was amazing because it was a very, everyone was like very like pearl clutching and like, oh, like her delicate sensibilities have been offended. But she was just like really funny and also was just like, this is fucked up. She was just like, and then she was like ripping into people, being hilarious, then being like, also Flint does not have clean water. And she was like just cutting between these like issues and like, it was amazing to watch because it was like, it's funny how horrible world is right now. And like in that room was like journalists and politicians who are like right now in the US having this very weird sort of thing where like journalists are afraid to like criticize too harshly. There's like a lot of weird stuff happening right now with like America in like that sense with like sort of the media and like the government. And so she just was like, you know, it's funny how horrible this is. Like, it's funny how scared you are. And like, we really need, you know, so I feel like, yeah, anyway, sorry, that was like a long, but I think humor is like really useful. And I think that like people laugh when they don't know what else to do. And I think that, it's sort of like hot and cold. Like you take someone to the sort of extreme place of like laughing at like a weird situation and then like take them down to some like really dark place. And I feel like that sort of cycling is like very useful. It's like, it's just like useful as a writer.
Very much so.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we get one more small reading in by you before we go to questions as well. So the part from Mothers would be great. So page 48.
Okay. So just as just the setup for this is that the protagonist of Mothers has recently broken up with her ex-girlfriend, and her ex-girlfriend comes to her and says, and with an infant, and says, I have a baby, the baby is yours. Like, we had this baby together, and gives her the baby, and then leaves. So yeah, this is just about the baby. Right? Yeah, okay. The baby's head is bothering me because it's like a piece of fruit gone bad. I understand that now in the middle of this endless desert of sound. It's like the soft spot on the peach that you can just plunge your thumb into, no questions asked, with not so much as a how do you do. I'm not going to, but I want to, and the urge is so serious I put her down. She screams louder. I pick her up and lean her against me, whispering, I love you, baby, and I am not going to hurt you, but the first thing is a lie, and the second thing might be a lie, but I'm not sure. I should have the urge to protect her, but all I can think about is that soft spot, that place where I could hurt her if I tried, that place where I could hurt her if I wanted to. Yep.
I think that bit just shows all of the senses that you engage in your writing as well. Like there is you can feel them when you're reading them. You can taste them. You can hear. It's amazing. That story has a very, we were talking about humour before, but this one has a very palpable kind of gut feeling of sadness to it. It's kind of shows things that people maybe deny for longer than they should, which is a very human thing. Can you tell us a bit about maybe what role the baby plays in this story?
Yeah, so this is a story, another story that I guess both the stories that like I sort of approached it from like a thing I wanted to write about, or like the two that are sort of the most raw and sort of difficult. But it's a story about a thing that doesn't get talked about a lot, which is domestic violence in same-sex relationships. And in the story, right, this woman's sort of denial of like the baby sort of comes as this like catalyst for her to sort of look back on this thing that had fallen apart and sort of explore like what it was. Mm-hmm. But what makes it so hard for me is that like she is still like deeply in pain. Like this is not a person who's like, oh, I'm gonna like, consider the nuances of like this relationship. Like she's just somebody who is like barely eking by, and has really just sort of been decimated by this person. And the baby is like this weird, like fabulous, like the baby shouldn't exist. Like the baby, they're two women, like it's not possible. And like what sort of the question of like what the baby is sort of exists throughout the story. Like is she real? Is she not real? Is she a figment of her imagination? Has she totally cracked? Is she just like totally off her rocker? Like what's going on? It just also is this like thing where like, because she has sort of just emerged from this relationship where she's been sort of knocked around, and suddenly she has this vulnerable thing in her care that like she is stronger than and like could hurt if she just cared to. And I was just really interested in that dynamic also sort of being played with and sort of seeing how she approached that. So yeah.
In terms of your, all of the things I sort of read in the intro, this book's getting wonderful sort of attention, very well deserved. I'm wondering for you as a writer, what are you wanting to sort of go on to do and achieve and say, I guess? Like there's a lot of things that you've kind of opened out with these short stories, and where do you see yourself sort of going from there?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I think that, I don't know. I mean, there's this really weird process or this really weird thing that happens where like with my first book, like this was my first book, I couldn't imagine beyond it. Like I was like, maybe I just have one book in me, and like, because I was like, people have more than one book that they write? Like, how is that possible? And it felt like impossible that I would get to that place, but all of a sudden, like right as the book was getting ready to come out, I started writing new work, and I realized I had this like whole new set of questions about, in this case, memory, something that that I wanted to write about, and like memory and its various sort of iterations. And so that's like a thing that I'm working on now. And then I also have a memoir that I'm writing, which is about something totally different. And I'm really interested in like haunted houses right now. So I'm like writing this like weird long essay about haunted houses. So I feel like it's really been exciting to sort of see like my interests just sort of like both like kind of blowing up in every way, but also like getting really weirdly specific. And just like following these like a bloodhound, just like following those paths wherever they take me, and like being really interested in what I want to be interested in and writing about what I want to write about. So yeah, I mean, I hope I have a career. I hope I get to write bad books. I feel like a lot of people don't like think about that exactly, but like most writers who write a lot have bad books where you're like, oh, that's a misstep. Oh, I love her, but that is a bad book. That is not good. I cannot believe that they published that. But I think that's actually a sign that like a writer is like taking risks and like maybe failing in that process. And I think that, yeah, I think all my favorite writers have had bad books, or bad stories, or bad, or things just weren't as successful as like the work of theirs that I like truly love. So I mean, I hope that for myself. But also just that I'm able to like write what I want to write. I think that, because the book is done so well, there's like this sense of sort of freedom in that I can, and also it's done well as a very weird project. And so there's like not as much pressure for me to like conform to anything. Like I can just sort of do what I want. And people are like, yeah, which is fun.
Yeah,
So.
You can go anywhere from here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Yeah. I think we're all really excited to read the bad books.
Yeah.
I'll go to the audience in just a sec, but so get those questions ready. But what is the hardest thing about writing for you, or perhaps broader, like the writing life?
I mean, time, which is sort of like the obvious answer. I mean, like right now I'm touring, and like I haven't written anything in like 7 months, or I've written like a couple of small things, but like I have stuff I really want to be writing, and I just like haven't had time. And when you write, like almost no writers support themselves on their own work. So like even if I wasn't touring for the book, like I teach, and when I teach, like it takes sort of the same, it comes from the same place in my brain as writing. So I like when I teach, I can't write. I come home and I like collapse on the couch and like watch TV. That's like all I can do when I'm done teaching. So it's really just sort of that balance, and like trying to figure out like how to make, and also writing is so inconstant. Like I'm very anxious, as I've previously discussed, and I like order, and I like having a paycheck every month, and I like this sense of sort of order. And when you're a writer, where you're just like, sometimes you get nothing, sometimes you get a big check, sometimes this thing happens. It's very hard to predict and hard to sort of plan, and I find that very stressful, and I don't like it. But and also I'm very impatient. I'm like really the least suited person to be a writer. Like all the things you got to be like patient, willing to kind of go with the flow, and I'm like none of those things. So it's like I made a bad choice, but whatever, it's fine.
Oh, well, we're very glad you did.
Thank you.
Okay, so questions from the audience now would be great. I think the microphone will go to you.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm so excited to see you, and I think the people next to me are as well. I wanted to ask a question in regards to, I think it was an interview you gave, I can't remember with whom, about humanising objects. And I thought that really touched a nerve with me, my family also from Latin America, and we have this thing where we bump into things and we apologise to things. And there was something about the logic and the rationale in your writing where the unspoken feels like it's that's not articulated or says still feels like it speaks to something. And I wanted to ask you about, that aspect of your writing where the real and the unreal is not necessarily clear or not necessarily a norm that everybody shares, and your experiences about that, because I think you may have referenced your grandmother and her storytelling in that interview.
Yeah, my grandfather. Yeah, So when I was a kid, I sort of got this idea in my head that like everything sort of in my immediate, it's very, way children are like egomaniacs, like everything's about you, so I was like, all of my furniture, all of my possessions are singularly imbued with consciousness, and I have to like treat them accordingly. So before we would go on vacation, I had this ritual where I would say goodbye to all my furniture, and I'd be like, I'm going away, I'm gone for 2 weeks, I'll be back, enjoy yourself. Because I was convinced, so the thing was that I would have nightmares about my bed eating me and like my chair eating me. And so I think I had this idea that if I didn't like perform this ritual, so it was sort of part of it was a sense of ritual behavior, which I think is, again, a thing that like kids do, anxious people do. There's like a lot of sort of overlap with those things. But also, this sense that like, and it's weird because like I'm a writer who writes fabulist fiction, and I don't believe in God, I don't believe in ghosts, I don't believe in any of those things. Like I am actually like pretty, I mean, if I saw a ghost, I would probably just die of like absolute fear. But like, though I kind of want to, well, I don't want to die, but I want to see a ghost. Anyway, but I want those things to be real, but they're not, I don't think they are. But they still interest me. And I still feel like when I exist in the world, I'm so aware of like the ways in which like things could be that way. Does that make sense? So like there's this, that way in which it's like there's, and not even just things like ghosts, but things like coincidence. Like what does it mean for like I love it in fiction, and I feel like I see this a lot in like, where it's like coincidentally, this like identical thing is happening thousands of miles away, but like they'll never meet and they'll never know that like these things are happening parallel to each other, and like that magic, right? With like happenstance and the ways in which, those sorts of magics, it just really is interesting to me. So I do feel like there's this sense of like, it sort of went from this like childhood thing where it was really about like ritual and really about, but actually believing that like it's possible that like these things, better safe than sorry, like, well, if I'd rather just do it and they're not conscious than like not do it and then I get eaten by my bed or whatever. So I do feel like but also this idea that like there's a sense of possibility. And I feel like, a lot of my ideas and a lot of my sort of thinking, like I'll be on a bus and I'll like see somebody and like think like, what if like this thing happened, and like how would this person react? And again, that sense of projection and that sense of like, how could this be magical, or how could this be a little unreal or like terrifying? And just like the way it's just something my brain is wired. And I think it is that like storytelling instinct. I think it's a little cultural. I watched a lot of Pee Wee Herman as a child, and he had like a chair that talked. I mean, I think there's like a lot of sort of things that kind of come together in that way, but yeah.
Hi. When you said that to be a writer you need to have a diagonal relationship with the world, what did you mean?
I meet people, I know people, and I have taught people, like as a teacher, who are like super literal. And I think, I say this, I'm saying this hesitantly because I'm sure there are probably exceptions, but I feel like it's difficult to be a successful writer if you're a super, super literal person, because to be a writer, I imagine a kind of artist, there has to be this sense of like what could be, or like the sense of metaphor, right? And it's sort of hard to explain to somebody I had this classmate who got really angry in a class once because someone had described a character eating fruit. It was fruit that had been frozen on a tree, like because of a frost. And she's eating the fruit and being like, it's like eating jewels or gems or something. And this classmate was like, I don't understand that metaphor because like, she's never eaten gems. Like, how would she know? And I remember just being like, but I feel like there is that sense of literalness where it's like, but like, it just isn't, I think it's not compatible. And so I feel like when it's talking about being diagonal, it's like, this sense of like, even if you're like like me, like a rationalist, like even if you're like, I don't believe in ghosts, but like there could be ghosts. And it's like that like weird sort of break between like possibility and metaphor and potential and narrative and that like knowing those things exist and like having a very comfortable relationship with those things. And also with like your own subconscious. Like basically half of my writing process is just like an aggressive relationship with, I mean, people I guess historically call like your muse, but it's just like my subconscious where it's like kicking things at me and I'm like, thanks subconscious, that's great. Mm-hmm. And like being very, even though I'm not like a sort of woo-woo kind of person, but like being kind of open to like the weird shit my brain is kicking out at me because I'm like, it's my brain and brains are really weird. And like, okay, sure, I embrace that. And I feel like you have to be an artist, you have to be comfortable with that space. And if you're not, I think it's just harder to like make art. I mean, I'm sure it's possible, but like, I don't know. I just feel like it just makes it a lot easier. So when people are like, where do ideas come from? I'm like, your mind, like your subconscious, like they come from you. And like, you have to learn how to like curate that and how to like maximize is the word. Like maximize that. And like, that's a process you have to kind of like learn how to do that. But like getting to that like place where like reality is like warm caramel and you're just sort of, everything is like possible and potential and like your brain's giving you weird shit and you're just like, all right, I embrace it. I'm rolling with it. And I just think that's like important. And it's just a part of being a writer.
Hi. I love that you're a fabulist writer and that you've been published widely in sci-fi journals, and yet you've had all this literary success. And I wondered if you've ever classified yourself as some kind of genre writer, or whether you've ever felt that the genre aspects of your writing have got in the way of literary success in any way.
I get asked this question a lot, and truthfully, oh no, sorry, I'm like, that's the end of my. I get asked the question a lot. That's it. No, I don't. And the answer, so like, no, I have never had anyone say to me, oh, this is sci-fi, so therefore I don't, like, that's never happened to me. Not a single time. I have had genre editors say things, because I have published in a lot of like science fiction, fantasy, horror magazines. I went to the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop in addition to getting MFA. And I have had people say to me like, the speculative element is too slight. This is like too literary for us. So it's sort of actually been the opposite for me. And that's fine because like also, you know, all journals and magazines have their readers and like the editors know their readers and they're like, our readers will not be satisfied with like this thing, you know? And so which is like fine. So yeah, so no, I've never really had that experience. When I was in grad school, I had a lot of classmates who were writing like realism, but they were like really supportive and like really helpful and really useful as readers for me. And I never really had that problem. So, but I identify sort of interchangeably in terms of like what kind of writer am I. I'd say horror is probably the closest for me right this moment because like I'm thinking about horror a lot now, but people describe me as like a fantasy writer, which I think is accurate, a literary writer, whatever that means. I'm like, that's accurate. Like a postmodernist, that's accurate. Like I feel like all those things it's all sort of the same to me. So
it's a mix. Hi, can you talk about why it's been important for you to write queer characters in your stories?
Because why not? Because I'm queer and I know a lot of queer people and I you know, it's important to me to like do that. And like, again, you have to like write what you want to see. So when I was like, I'm dissatisfied with the queer representation in like specific kinds of literature, I decided to write them in for myself. Because when I read, like I'll never forget like reading Sarah Waters when I was maybe 15, 16. I was like not even out to myself yet. And I was like reading Fingersmith. Has anyone here read Fingersmith? Oh yeah, it's good. That's the shit. It's good stuff. And I was like, this feels really gay to me, but I don't know why. And then it was like really gay, and I was like weirdly excited. I was like, well, I didn't know that was coming, but that was really nice. I really liked that romance. And it was great. So yeah, so I sort of feel like, and the thrill of that, and like even before I knew that I was queer, like seeing myself in that way, and also being like titillated specifically for myself, like being like, this is very sexy, which is like exciting when you're like reading something that's like sexy and it's like for you, and you're like, oh, that's cool. So yeah, so it just was really important to me, and I wanted to do it, and I was like, well, I can, so why not?
I think we can squeeze in one more quick one.
Hi, Carmen. I really liked your piece about the influence of Shirley Jackson on your work, and I was wondering if you could talk quickly about the influences from horror and weird fiction that have changed you and your process of writing.
Yeah, so again, before that sort of moment in grad school that I mentioned before, where I was getting a lot of, I was like sort of reading all these writers like Shirley Jackson who I'd never read before. When I was young, I really loved like Lois Duncan, who wrote these like thrillers for young people. I read a lot of horror when I, like Christopher Pike and R.L. Stine, they were not great. Or Lois Duncan was great. Christopher Pike, not so much, kind of ridiculous. I read a lot of also like gothic, like V.C. Andrews, Flowers in the Attic. Have you? Yeah. Like every 11-year-old who should not have been reading that book. I was like, what is happening? Like, this is very horrible and strange, and I kind of love it, and I can't stop reading it. I read like all those books. So I feel like as a young person, it was like a lot of gothic stuff. I read a lot of like, or John Bellairs was another horror writer for children that I read. I really liked like also like kind of capital W weird, like Shel Silverstein and Roald Dahl, and I really loved Louis Sehgal, who wrote the Sideways Stories from Wayside School books too. I don't know if you guys. There were these like really bizarre, like super postmodern, like just impossible to describe books about this like weird fictional school, and they're like brilliant and really funny and tremendous, and I absolutely loved them. So I feel like I just got like a really good dose of that as a kid, and then when I sort of was refreshed many years later with like writers like Shirley Jackson and Angela Carter, Kelly Link, Karen Russell, George Saunders, Amy Bender, Helen Oyeyemi, I suddenly found myself thinking again about those like early influences and thinking about like especially I think the Gothic influence was like pretty major. I actually at some point was writing an essay about Lois Duncan when she died. She died a few years ago, and I wrote an essay about her, and I realized upon rereading one of her books that like over the course of my writing career, I had burned down a lot of buildings as like a dramatic final gesture. And there was like and I was like, oh, that's really Gothic. And also there's like a book where she does that, where it's like the final gesture is like this burning boarding school, these girls like running for their lives out of the boarding school. And I was like, oh yeah. So I feel like the Gothic influence was like pretty intense when I was a kid. So I feel like, but the fun part about it is like that sort of wide ranging, like, the cool thing about like not being super concerned with genre is thinking about like, I just take what I want. So it's like, I read this, I liked it, I took this thing. I read this, I loved this, I took this thing. And like just letting yourself have that kind of varied diet in reading that then permits you to like be a writer who's like coming at these things from lots of different angles. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Carmen, thank you so much for this
course.
wonderful
Thank you for having
collection,
me.
and thank you for tonight. And of course, we've got readings up the back. You can buy the book, and Carmen will be signing up in the back corner there. Thanks for being a great audience. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.